On an isolated airfield in the flat, remote Norfolk countryside, it's the 4th of July 1942 and 12 aircraft stand waiting on the tarmac, ready to bomb 4 German airfields in the Netherlands. 6 of those planes were crewed by American airmen, the first bombing mission carried out over enemy-occupied Europe to involve our new allies since they joined the war at the end of 1941. One thing in particular stands out about these new flyers and the thousands who bravely followed them. Nearly every one of them was white, despite the fact that about 300,000 African-American GIs passed through Britain between early 1942 and the Declaration of Peace in 1945. Those men were more likely to fight their war with a shovel and bare hands, working behind the front line, because they weren't allowed to bear arms. They were segregated from their fellow white Americans in work, rest and play. But wartime Britain was a very different society. The culture shock was big enough that arriving American GIs were shown a film starring Burgess Meredith called Welcome to Britain. As well as our warm beer, awful coffee and inability to express our emotions, it also had to explain what was, by the standards of the day, a relatively liberal attitude to race.
Now let's be frank about it. There are colored soldiers as well as white here, and there are less social restrictions in this country. Look, that might not happen at home, but the point is we're not at home. And the point is, too, if we bring a lot of prejudices here, what are we going to do about them?
So what was it like being an African-American soldier in wartime Britain? And why don't we hear more about the experience of black GIs? Making History sent the young poet Jeremiah Sugar J. Brown in search of this little-known chapter in our wartime story.
That's how they mark 12 o'clock at Cambridge American Cemetery and Memorial at Madingley. It's a landscape of green, lots of trees, everything neatly taken care of, and it's almost like an infinite arch of crosses and stars of David lined perfectly, and is strangely beautiful for a cemetery.
Hi, my name's Susie Harrison. I work here at Cambridge American Cemetery. There are actually 3,812 individual sets of remains buried here in the cemetery.
Are there any black servicemen buried here?
There were known to be 128 black servicemen. I had done some research and I found somebody that I knew to be a black serviceman was in fact buried here as well, but was noted down as white. And because of our Faces of Cambridge project, we found another gentleman who was also an African American, and so that makes it 130.
Can you tell me about some of the roles that the black servicemen who were buried here undertook?
Well, initially, African Americans were not considered for frontline fighting roles. They were put into support units, so they would be truck drivers, they'd be transporting ammunition, and it was they, in many cases, who were the engineering battalions that actually constructed this huge network of nearly 130 airfields in the east of England.
The countryside was never the same again.
Dust and dirt and trees coming down and...
I mean, all the little meadows and spinneys and that, they all disappeared, you know, all bulldozed out.
We had never seen anything like this before.
The Americans, when they joined the Second World War and came to Britain in 1942, brought everything with them. My name's David Cain, and I led the Heritage Lottery Fund project, the 8th and East. In practical terms, they brought the people, they brought the planes, they brought the gasoline, they brought the food, they brought the bombs, but they also brought segregation with them.
The African-Americans were in separate messes, separate dormitories, separate everything.
The black GIs weren't segregated from white British people. It was literally just between white Americans and black Americans. They could mix freely as they wanted to with other British people or people from other countries based in the UK.
We absorbed the Americans regardless of their race.
But when the white guys come in, they didn't want nothing to do with the blacks.
My name's Lucy Bland. I'm a professor of social and cultural history at Anglo-Ruskin University in Cambridge.
So why was there segregation amongst the servicemen when they were in Britain?
Well, it was a segregated army, and when they came over here, the Americans got very anxious about the conflicts that were going to develop between the white GIs and the black GIs.
The boy I was going with seriously at the end, he was in what they called the complement squadron. We had a big truck of black soldiers go through one day, and I gave a little wave to one of them because he was waving at me. And this chap I was walking down the road. "Don't you talk to those son of a," the way they do talk. And I said, "Look," "he's got red blood in his veins, the same colour as yours."
So what they did was they introduced a series of different kinds of segregation. So different towns, sometimes they would be blacks only one day, whites only the next. They never put it in those terms. They said, this battalion, this day, this the next. But that's effectively what it was.
They set up a black zone and a white zone because the trouble was happening all in the pubs.
And if any sort of fight ever broke out, someone would call the American military police. They would come and they'd really beat up the black Americans. You never saw them hit a white American, but they would really beat them up.
The British were very ambivalent because on the one hand, they couldn't be seen to be confronting the Americans about this because here were their allies that they're very dependent on, so they couldn't say, "You can't do this." But on the other hand, they were having a whole lot of troops and munition workers over from the West Indies, and so they didn't want to look as if they were supporting segregation. So they tried to walk do this balancing act, which I think not very successfully.
Why do you say the balancing act wasn't successful?
Well, I think that a lot of people did see this was a contradiction, and certainly quite a lot of African Caribbean people could see that was a contradiction, and some of them were attacked by white GIs. I mean, many in the cabinet didn't want them here at all because they thought it would lead to friction and it would lead to mixed-race children. I mean, the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, makes this point: we are going to have mixed-race babies. And, what are we going to do about that? I mean, extraordinary.
Lucy Bland with poet Jeremiah Sugar J. Brown. Of course, relationships between black GIs and white British women did happen, and pregnancies did result. But one of the problems these couples faced was that GIs were not allowed to get married without the permission of their commanding officer. And in the case of black soldiers wanting to marry their white girlfriends, that permission was not forthcoming. Other cases were even more complicated. Permission to marry wouldn't have helped Terry Harrison's mother because she already had a husband. When he was called up, she was left at home in their Leicestershire village to look after their 5 children. But then, in 1944, she gave birth to 2 more, twins Terry and Susan, after a brief encounter with an African-American serviceman. Terry's on the phone now. Terry, what was the reaction in the village where your mum was living when you and your sister were born?
Well, I think one of utter surprise and, in some respects, disgust from the various villagers, etc. And it did affect Mum for many years to come, and indeed it did affect me and my sister. But the main thing is that Mum could have, at that stage, given Susan and I away for adoption.
And your mum very bravely decided to keep you and your sister, and she faced overt hostility within the village and in the family?
There's no doubt, and if I have some emotion in my voice, I can still recall the hurt that was caused to her by the villagers who often would walk on the other side of the street or bang the dustbin lids, but Mum stuck through it, and thank goodness.
And when did you finally get to grips with the story of your real father, and what was that story?
Well, if I do sound emotional, I do apologise, but one of the things that my siblings and the neighbours and friends of my mum all told me that my father was killed in a plane crash, and he was killed abroad, and it just wasn't true. I just felt, as I grew older, I wanted to find out more about Dad, and I found what happened was that he was killed in a racial incident in Cardiff, in Wales. He'd gone out with 6 black Americans, and they came back, and the American Shore Patrol, the White Shore Patrol, told the Land Rover to stop, and they didn't. And he shot at the Land Rover, and the bullet went through my father's heart. And I went down to Cardiff, where he was based at that time, and I found in the paper a small bit saying that America had been killed And I checked through the records, and eventually I found his name, and I wrote to the American War Commission and found that he was actually buried in a place called Madingley, which was an American cemetery. And on my 65th birthday, I went to Madingley, and there his grave was.
And what was his name?
Hendricks, John Lawrence Hendricks.
Terry Harrison, thank you. Clive Webb, why has it taken so long for stories like Terry's to come out?
There have been times in the past when these stories have appeared in one form or another. Neville Shute, for example, wrote a novel shortly after the war called The Checkerboard, which talks movingly about an interracial relationship. But I think fundamentally we have tended to think of race as an issue that is more germane to countries like the United States than it is to our own. That has led to the marginalisation of race as a category of analysis for historians. It's only been very recently that historians have started to take the history of race in this country that seriously. And interestingly enough, a lot of that research has been driven by Americans.
Janet Dugdale in Liverpool, should our heritage sector, museums and libraries and so on, have done more to bring these stories to light?
I'm sure that we should, actually, and I think now we do. There's a lot that we've already been talking about and listening to today that fits in with Liverpool's history and the history of Liverpool's black community, also the Second World War as well, because right outside Liverpool there was a big American air base, Burton Wood, and there were GIs stationed around that part of Merseyside, and actually there were more black GIs than there were white, and it seems that the kind of colour bar was really affected on a kind of local pub, dance hall basis.
Clive, we're hearing that this story has been sort of sidelined here in the UK, but what impact did the black experience of World War II have back in the States?
The Second World War is the crucible in which the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s is forged. Essentially, if you are an African American, especially in the southern states, you are told constantly that segregation is a natural and innate order of things. It's not only implemented by man, but it's ordained by God. So for African Americans who have never left the South before, who are stationed overseas in countries like Britain and France, what happens is they experience an alternative. They realize that actually black and white can live together, can interact, can build friendships, romantic relations, and so forth. And that serves as a powerful catalyst for change, so that when black GIs return home after the war, it's no coincidence that they are at the vanguard of the emerging civil rights movement. It's black GIs who've served overseas, who lead the drive for voter registration, who will form the front ranks of the civil rights movement in the late 1940s through the 50s and 60s.